All leaders face this from time to time. The dreaded, tell me about yourself. Maybe it's a sales pitch trying to land a new client. Maybe it's when you're introduced at a networking event or even at a leadership panel where you've been asked to share your expertise. And chances are you start with your accomplishments, something you're proud of, like years of experience leading your company. Maybe you touch on the recognition for a milestone in your career. However the story goes, it's clear. You are successful. You've accomplished a lot. So then, why does something nag you when you reflect on your story? Why aren't you as impressed as those listening? And why, after everything you've accomplished, is it difficult to figure out what's next? This is Craft to Clarity, where we distill the tension between what you built and what you're built for. I'm Steve Moscato, and welcome. As leaders, we learn the importance of telling stories. Leading our communications team, we seek to tell our brand story. With our donors and investors, we tell stories of our financial stewardship. With our teams, we share stories of exceeding our goals. These stories seek to paint a picture using facts, to present a picture that inspires, motivates, and encourages. Stories that build credibility and demonstrate purpose. But the facts themselves aren't the story. The story is what those facts mean. So why is it, when we're asked to share our story, we so often treat it like a bio, a chronological account of how we got here? A bio tells us what happened. Not everything, of course, just the events that we decided are important and relevant. The things that we think are interesting or noteworthy, and often the things that we're proud of. But a story, on the other hand, well, that's different. Stories tell less about what happened and more about what happened actually meant. And that distinction matters when we start asking one of the questions that seems to show up for a lot of successful leaders. What's next? Because think about what we do when we try to answer that question. We look backward. We look at what we've done, what we've been good at, where we've succeeded, what people have valued us for, and where we've been rewarded. We use the evidence of our past to help us imagine our future. And there's nothing wrong with that. Except, what if the version of the past we're using is incomplete? Think about your own story. Maybe you've been leading for 30 years. That's an impressive statement. 30 years of leadership. But what does that actually tell me? Maybe it was 15 years with one organization, then 2 years doing something completely different, 4 years building something, a year somewhere else, and then another 8 years leading where you are today. We compress all of that into, I've been a leader for 30 years. It's accurate, but we've taken 30 years of experiences, people, decisions, successes and disappointments, risks and mistakes, and unexpected turns and turned them into a credential. And that's where I think we may miss something. Because maybe somewhere in those 30 years, there's a year you don't normally talk about. Maybe it didn't work out. Maybe you hated the job or took a risk and failed. Maybe you were passed over. Or maybe nothing happened during the year that seemed particularly impressive. So when you tell your story, you may skip it. But then I might ask, what happened in the 5 years after that? Did you lead differently? Make different decisions? Did something matter to you that hadn't mattered before? Would you have led those next 5 years the same way if that 1 year hadn't happened? Suddenly, the year that didn't seem important starts looking a little different. Maybe you didn't forget it. Maybe you just didn't count it. And that's actually where whiskey can give us a useful way of thinking about this. Imagine if I hand you a glass of whiskey and tell you it's a 15-year-old whiskey. That's useful information. It's impressive. But it doesn't tell you everything about how the whiskey in that glass became what it was. Maybe it spent 10 years aging under one set of conditions, and then another 5 years finishing in a completely different cask. Same 15 years, but those different conditions contributed different things. And if I'm going to try to understand what I'm tasting today, knowing simply that it's a 15-year-old whiskey isn't enough. I want to understand what happened during those 15 years. I think the same thing happens with us. 30 years of leadership tells me how long you've been leading. It doesn't necessarily tell me how those 30 years formed the leader sitting with me today. And sometimes the seasons that we'd most likely leave off the label may have contributed something essential to what we're experiencing today. If you're trying to discern what's next, that distinction matters. Because success gives us very real evidence of what we're capable of. It tells us what we've built, what we've done well, and what other people have valued. But I'm not convinced it always tells us everything we're built for. This is where I invite you to go back to your story. Not your bio, your story. Think about how the job you hated, the opportunity you didn't take, the failure no one knows about. Maybe it was a boss who changed how you lead, or a season when you wanted to give up. Maybe it was something that looked insignificant at the time, but ended up changing everything. I'm not suggesting those experiences are somehow more important because they're difficult. And I'm certainly not suggesting that we go digging through our past looking for pain so we can give everything some profound meaning. That's not the point. I'm asking something much simpler. What have you left out of your story? And why? Maybe you simply didn't think it mattered. But maybe there's another possibility. Maybe leaving it out served you in some way. Maybe it didn't fit the version of yourself you needed other people to see. Or maybe it didn't fit the version you needed to see for yourself. Sometimes the stories we leave out aren't simply forgotten. Sometimes they're protected. And that makes me curious about something deeper. What was leaving it out doing it for you? Maybe it allowed you to move forward. Maybe it helped prove something to yourself. Maybe it reinforced the leader you needed to become at the time. And maybe it served you incredibly well. But does it still? Because the point isn't to decide whether experience was good or bad. It's to understand what it contributed. What changed afterward? What started showing up in how you led, what you noticed, or what mattered to you? Those aren't necessarily answers. They're signals. And a signal is different from an answer. A signal doesn't tell you to leave your job, start a company, or write a book, or change your life. It simply gives you something worth paying attention to. And this is where the work of the distiller becomes important. A master distiller doesn't walk into the process already knowing what they're going to find. They pay attention to the ingredients, to the conditions, to what happens beneath the surface. They separate. They notice. They learn to recognize what belongs and what doesn't. And eventually, something becomes clearer. I think there's a temptation when successful leaders ask, "What's next?" to immediately go looking for an answer. Maybe I should consult or write a book. Maybe I should join a board, start another company, retire, or stay exactly where I am. But those are containers. And before we rush to choose one, maybe there's some distillation that we need to do. If we were sitting having a whiskey and talking about your next season, I don't know that I would start by asking you what you want to do. I might simply say, "Tell me your story." And then I'd listen. I'd listen for what you chose to tell me. I'd notice what seems to be missing. I'd listen for the experiences that keep showing up across very different seasons. And eventually, I might ask, "What do you notice?" Because like a great distiller, my job isn't to tell you what you're supposed to taste. It's to help create the conditions where you can begin to notice the signals and discern what they mean for you. And you can turn the tables right on me as well. I've been distilling my own story as I worked on this episode. And I realized there's something from my 18 years at Bridgestone that I never really counted. At one point, I was asked to give monthly presentations to groups of 50 or 60 new store managers. I did not want to do it. I never thought of myself as a presenter. I stutter, I get nervous, and I assume people probably weren't there being interested in what I had to say. But it was part of the job, so I did it. And eventually I grew to love it. People listened and engaged. They asked questions and came up afterward. And what I really enjoyed wasn't simply presenting marketing information. I was helping these new managers see their role differently, helping them connect what they did every day to the larger brand, the customer experience, and the promise we were making. After I left Bridgestone, they even brought me back to speak to a group of dealers. When I was finished, there was a line of people waiting to ask questions and get advice about their business. But here's what's interesting. When I left Bridgestone to start iBrand, I didn't count any of that. I built from what I knew, marketing. And that made sense. I had 18 years of experience to draw on. But I also had a pretty narrow definition of where my value came from. I thought my expertise was mostly in the doing, building the website, developing the strategy, solving the problem. Those experiences in the room, I thought they were just part of the job. But now I see them differently. Maybe what mattered wasn't that I discovered I could present. Maybe it was that I was able to help people see something completely differently, to connect what mattered with how they thought and operated and showed up. And that's much closer to how I think about my work today. But there's another part I'm still distilling. For a long time, being the expert gave me reason to belong in the room. I knew the answer. I had something tangible that I could point to that justified me being there. Working differently requires me to give some of that up. I have to give up the thought that I don't belong in the room unless I'm the one with the answer. I'm still working on that. And that's why I don't look back at those presentations and think, there it is. That's what I was always supposed to do. I see something even simpler. I see evidence that I didn't count. And I think that's one of the main reasons successful leaders struggle so much with figuring out what's next in the season between what they built and what they're built for. We have decades of experience, but we've organized much of that evidence around success, the roles, the accomplishments, the milestones. And it's that evidence we use when we ask ourselves what's next. That can make clarity difficult because the answers tend to look a lot like what we've already done, just a bigger version. And maybe a different organization, a new title, a similar role with a little more freedom. And I think there's another reason that this gets difficult. Success can make it harder to question the path we're already on. I'm good at this. People value me for this. I've been successful doing this. So it's easy to assume that this must be what I'm built for. Maybe. But success is evidence of what you've been capable of building. It isn't necessarily proof of everything you're built for. That's why looking at our fuller story matters. It isn't going to reveal some hidden answer about what we're supposed to do next. It simply gives us a more complete evidence from which to discern. And that evidence may lead you somewhere completely different. Or you may stay exactly where you are. Maybe the change isn't what you do at all. Maybe it's how you lead, what you give your attention to, or how you steward the experience you've accumulated. That's the point. We're not trying to manufacture an answer to what's next. We're trying to see more clearly what's already there. And this becomes particularly important in what I've been calling the fourth quarter. At some point, the road ahead of us stops feeling unlimited. Time itself becomes something we're stewarding. Maybe these questions have been there for years. The fourth quarter simply makes them harder to postpone. And the question that surfaces sounds something like, is what I've built everything I'm built for? That's a question worth paying attention to. When you go to a whiskey tasting, you don't just read the labels of what you're tasting. You hear the stories of how the whiskey was made, what went into it, the conditions that shaped it, what gave it the depth and character you're experiencing. Here are my tasting notes from today. First, what have you stopped counting? Think about that version of your story you normally tell. What's missing? What didn't seem important enough to count? And be curious about why. Maybe it simply seemed unimportant, or maybe leaving it out has served you in some way. Second, what did it contribute? Don't worry about whether it was good or bad. Pay attention to what changed afterward. What began showing up in how you led, what you noticed, or what mattered to you. And third, what do you notice? Don't force an answer about what's next. Just pay attention to the signals. Because sometimes clarity doesn't begin by figuring out where you're going. It begins by seeing more clearly what has already been forming in you. So let's go back to where we started. Someone looks across the room and says, "Tell me about yourself." You could tell them about the company you built, the years you've been leading, the growth, the recognition, the milestones. And all of that would be true. You've accomplished a lot. But remember the question I asked at the beginning. Why aren't you as impressed as the people listening? Maybe it's because somewhere underneath those accomplishments, you know there's more to the story. There's the year you stopped counting, the experience that didn't look like success, the person who changed you, the thing you kept finding yourself drawn to, the things that don't make the bio, but somehow keep showing up in the leader you've become. And if you're trying to figure out what's next, maybe you don't need to rush towards another answer. Maybe you just need to listen to your story again. But this time, like a distiller. Because the answer to what's next may not begin somewhere out in front of you. The first signal might already be somewhere in the story you've lived, waiting for you to count it. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. If today's conversation resonated with you, don't let it end here. Visit craftedclarity.net to explore more conversations, reflections, and resources designed to help you distill the tension between what you built and what you're built for. You can explore the Still, a curated experience that helps you find the right conversation for the season you're in, learn more about leadership experiences and facilitation through the work of the Distiller, or connect with me directly for a one-on-one conversation. Whatever you're navigating, you don't have to distill it alone. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted.